June 14, 1944, 8 days after the D-Day landings. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, 2 miles south of Carentan, Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski's M4A1, Sherman ground to a halt behind a stone wall. The engine sputtered unevenly as he peered through his periscope, fixing his gaze on another Sherman burning 300 yards ahead. Black smoke billowed into the sky. The crew had bailed out, sprinting through the tall grass. One man stumbled, and a comrade stopped to help. Both fell moments later as a second round slammed into the disabled tank, igniting its ammunition. The explosion launched the turret 12 feet upward. That marked the fourth Sherman lost in just 20 minutes. Kowalski keyed his radio. Baker 23 to Baker Actual. We've got a concealed 88mm gun in the tree line. Request smoke cover and authorization to withdraw. Static crackled in response. Baker 23, negative on withdrawal. Intelligence reports minimal armor presence. Proceed with advance. Kowalski's jaw tightened. Minimal armor presence? Right. Someone back at headquarters was relying on yesterday's reconnaissance while 5 tank crews burned alive in the harsh reality of today. He glanced at his loader, Private Danny Castellano, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn. The kid's hands trembled as he checked the ready rack. 4 75mm high-explosive rounds. 17 more sat in the turret basket, 30 in the sponson bins along the hull sides, directly above the tracks. 51 rounds total. 51 potential detonations waiting to turn their 30-ton steel coffin into a crematorium. Driver, advance 50 yards. Gunner, keep an eye on that tree line, Kowalski ordered. The Sherman lurched forward. Corporal James Morrison, the gunner, swept his periscope across the hedgerows. I don't see a thing, Sarge. No muzzle flash, no movement. He's there, Kowalski insisted. Took out 4 of ours. He's waiting. They covered 30 yards before the stone wall fell out of sight, leaving them exposed, silhouetted against the open field. Kowalski's palms were sweaty on the commander's override. Every instinct screamed to reverse, to get back to cover. But orders were orders. Minimal armor presence. Proceed with advance. The round struck low, punching through the right sponson at a shallow angle. Kowalski felt the impact before he heard it, a metallic crunch, followed by a pressure wave that compressed the air inside the tank. The penetrating shell fragmented on entry, spraying superheated steel shrapnel through the crew compartment. One shard hit the sponson ammunition rack. The 75mm propellant charges ignited instantly. Bang, bang, bang. The sponson erupted in a chain reaction. 30 rounds cooking off in rapid succession, each detonation fueling the next. The temperature inside the compartment skyrocketed from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to 400 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 3 seconds. Castellano screamed as the ready rack behind him caught fire, 4 rounds exploding simultaneously and turning his position into a blast furnace. Kowalski grabbed the kid's shoulder, trying to yank him toward the commander's hatch, but Castellano's uniform was already ablaze. Morrison acted faster. The gunner kicked open his hatch and bailed out in one fluid motion, landing hard on the engine deck. Kowalski shoved Castellano toward the open hatch, but the kid was no longer moving on his own, just screaming. He got him halfway out before another detonation in the turret basket slammed the hatch shut. The impact threw Kowalski backward into the radio, and he tasted blood. His left arm lay limp, unresponsive. Thick, black, toxic smoke filled the compartment. He couldn't see Castellano, couldn't see anything. He found the commander's hatch by touch. The metal was so hot it burned through his gloves. He rammed it open with his shoulder and hauled himself out. Fresh air hit him like a slap. He rolled off the turret, fell 6 feet to the ground, and began crawling. Behind him, the Sherman's ammunition continued to detonate, flames pouring from every hatch and vision port. Kowalski crawled 20 yards before his arms gave out. He collapsed in the grass, watching his tank burn. 5 minutes later, Morrison found him. The gunner's face was scorched, his uniform smoldering. "Where's Castellano?" Kowalski didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. 3 miles east, in a different hedgerow, a vastly different scene was unfolding. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes commanded a platoon of 4 Shermans, all M4A1 variants equipped with a new 76mm gun. More importantly, each bore a designation that had meant nothing to Hayes when he first saw it stenciled on the hull. M4A 176W. The W stood for wet stowage. Hayes hadn't paid much attention to the label. When the quartermaster sergeant had signed over the tanks in England, he'd mentioned something about ammunition racks and fire suppression, but Hayes had been fixated on the upgraded gun. 76 millimeters instead of 75 millimeters. Higher velocity, better penetration against German armor. That's what mattered in a tank fight. That's what kept you alive. Or so he thought. His platoon advanced through the same hedgerow country that had claimed Kowalski's crew. The same terrain, the same concealed anti-tank positions, the same deadly geometry of ambush and crossfire. Hayes's lead tank, commanded by Sergeant William Drake, rounded a bocage corner and took a hit from a Panzer IV 300 yards away. The 75 millimeter round penetrated the right side of the hull, low and angled, tearing through the sponson area. Hayes watched through binoculars, bracing for the familiar explosion, the turret lifting off, the crew bailing out in flames. But nothing happened. Drake's Sherman shuddered from the impact. Smoke poured from the entry hole, but there were no secondary detonations, no chain reaction of exploding ammunition. The turret stayed in place, and 5 seconds after being hit, Drake's gunner returned fire. The 76 millimeter gun roared once, and the Panzer IV's turret rang like a bell as the round punched through its frontal armor. The German tank lurched to a stop, smoke billowing from its engine deck. Drake's voice crackled over the radio. Baker 31 to Baker Actual. We're hit but mobile. Right sponson penetration. No casualties. Ammunition racks intact. Continuing advance. Hayes stared at the radio handset as if it had spoken in a foreign language. No casualties. Ammunition racks intact. That was impossible. He'd watched a dozen Shermans brew up from sponson hits, crews burning, tanks detonating like bombs. Drake's Sherman should be in flames right now, its crew dead or dying. But they weren't. Hayes keyed his radio. Drake, say again. You took a penetrating hit in the sponson? Affirmative. Went right through the ammo rack area, but nothing cooked off. The rounds are stored in some kind of liquid containers on the hull floor. The shell must have missed them. Liquid containers. Wet stowage. Hayes suddenly recalled the quartermaster's explanation. The upgraded Shermans featured redesigned ammunition storage. Instead of exposed racks along the sponson shelves, the rounds were stored in sealed bins on the hull floor, surrounded by a mixture of water and ethylene glycol. If a penetrating shell hit the ammunition area, the liquid would spill out, smothering any flames before they could ignite the propellant charges. It sounded absurd. Who designed a fire suppression system based on water jackets around individual ammunition bins? But Hayes wasn't complaining. Drake's crew was alive, and the tank was still fighting. That's all that mattered. The platoon pressed on. Over the next 4 hours, Hayes's Shermans engaged 6 German tanks and 8 anti-tank positions, taking 11 penetrating hits. 3 tanks were disabled by track damage or engine fires, but not a single Sherman suffered an ammunition detonation. Not one crew member burned. The wet stowage system worked exactly as designed, buying precious seconds for crews to escape, even as their tanks fell apart around them. By nightfall, Hayes had lost 1 Sherman to a mobility kill, but 0 crew fatalities. 3 men were wounded, none seriously. He radioed the company commander to report his platoon's status, and the response was immediate. What the hell kind of magic tanks are you driving? Hayes glanced at his M4A 176W, parked intact behind a hedgerow. Its right side was scorched black from a near miss. The paint blistered, but the crew was alive, brewing coffee on a portable stove and joking about the German gunner's poor aim. Not magic, Hayes said into the radio, just better engineering. 300 miles east at a Wehrmacht tank depot outside Falaise, Oberleutnant Klaus Werner read a disturbing intelligence report. Werner commanded a company of Panzer IVs, veterans of the Eastern Front, now redeployed to halt the Allied breakout. The report described a troubling trend. American Sherman tanks were no longer bursting into flames when hit in their ammunition storage areas. Werner read the report twice, then a third time. It made no sense. The Sherman's vulnerability to ammunition fires was a well-documented weakness, exploited relentlessly by German tank commanders since North Africa. Hit the sponson, hit the turret basket, aim for the ammo racks. The Sherman would detonate like a bomb, killing the crew instantly or forcing them to bail out into machine gun fire. That's how you destroyed Shermans. That's how Werner had taken out 11 of them during the retreat from Kursk. But according to the intelligence summary, something had shifted. Recent engagements reported Sherman tanks surviving direct hits to their ammunition storage without secondary explosions. Crews were escaping disabled tanks with minimal casualties. The feared brew-up was becoming a rarity. Werner summoned his tank commanders and read them the report. The reaction was immediate skepticism. Propaganda, declared Hauptmann Ernst Becker, leader of the lead platoon. The Americans want us to think their tanks are invincible. Psychological warfare. Maybe, Werner conceded, but maybe they've actually fixed the problem. And if they have, we need to know how. Because right now, our entire doctrine relies on taking out Shermans quickly. If we can't make them burn, we need a new approach. The next morning, Werner's company engaged an American armored column near Villers-Bocage. The lead element consisted of 8 Shermans advancing in a staggered formation across open farmland. Werner positioned his Panzer IVs in a tree line, dug in with clear fields of fire, a textbook ambush setup. The Americans were exposed, overconfident, moving too fast without infantry support. Easy targets. Werner's gunner locked onto the lead Sherman at 800 meters. Target identified, Sherman, range 800. Permission to fire. Fire! The 75mm gun cracked. The round struck the Sherman's right side, punching through the sponson just above the tracks. Werner watched through his commander's optics, waiting for the explosion. The Sherman lurched sideways from the impact, smoke pouring from the entry hole. It ground to a halt, tracks damaged, but no fire, no secondary detonations, no turret flying into the sky. Instead, the Sherman's turret rotated smoothly, locking onto Werner's position. 5 seconds after being hit, the American tank returned fire. The rounds sailed high, screaming over Werner's Panzer IV and detonating in the trees behind them. But the message was clear. The Sherman was still in the fight. Werner's 2nd Panzer IV fired, striking the same Sherman in the front of the turret. The round ricocheted off the mantlet, leaving a bright scar on the cast steel. The Sherman fired again, this time hitting Werner's 2nd tank in the hull. The Panzer IV erupted in flames, its ammunition cooking off in a chain reaction that killed the crew instantly. Werner's stomach tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen. His tanks were in perfect ambush positions. His gunners were veterans who'd scored first-round hits on stationary targets at optimal range, and yet the Americans were gaining the upper hand. The remaining Shermans accelerated, charging directly into the ambush. Suicidal tactics, or so Werner thought. His gunners fired 3 more rounds, scoring 2 additional hits. 1 Sherman lost a track and ground to a halt. But the other 5 kept coming, firing on the move and suppressing Werner's position with high explosive rounds that turned the tree line into a storm of shrapnel and splinters. Werner ordered a withdrawal. 3 of his Panzer IVs escaped. 2 burned in the tree line, destroyed by direct hits from 76mm rounds that punched through their frontal armor like paper. The Americans had lost 2 tanks to disablement, but 0 destroyed and 0 casualties that Werner could confirm. That evening, Werner wrote a detailed after-action report describing the engagement objectively, without exaggeration. American Sherman tanks demonstrating unexpected resilience, multiple penetrating hits failing to trigger catastrophic ammunition detonations, crew survival rates far exceeding previous encounters. He recommended an immediate investigation and tactical adjustments. The report made its way up the chain of command, reaching Army Group B headquarters 3 days later. Intelligence officers read it with growing alarm. Werner wasn't the only commander reporting this phenomenon. Similar accounts flooded in from across the Normandy front. Shermans surviving hits that should have destroyed them. Crews escaping disabled tanks and returning to combat in replacement vehicles. The psychological impact on German tank crews was mounting. The question was simple. What had changed? 5,000 miles away in Detroit, Michigan, the answer was rolling off an assembly line. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors had converted its automotive production facilities to military manufacturing in early 1942. By 1944, The plant was churning out modified M4A3 Sherman tanks at a rate of 300 per month, everyone bearing the W designation for wet stowage. This revolutionary redesign moved ammunition storage from the vulnerable sponson racks to protected bins on the hull floor, surrounded by liquid-filled containers. The concept wasn't complex. Each ammunition bin held 10 rounds, separated by 3 small containers filled with a mixture of water, ethylene glycol, and rust inhibitor, a fluid called ammudump. If a penetrating shell hit the ammunition area, the containers would rupture, spilling the liquid and smothering any ignition before it could spread to the propellant charges. Simple physics, simple chemistry, and brutally effective. The system added 900 pounds to the tank's weight, but it reduced ammunition fire rates by 85%. In practical terms, that meant crews had a fighting chance to escape even catastrophically damaged tanks. The Sherman was still vulnerable, still outgunned by German heavy armor, but it was no longer a death trap. Production of the wet stowage Sherman began in January 1944 with the M4A176W variant. By April, 130 units had been shipped to England in preparation for the D-Day invasion. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions each received 52 of the upgraded tanks, but concerns about crew training on the new 76mm gun delayed their deployment. The wet stowage Sherman sat idle in depots while the invasion force went ashore with older models, still equipped with dry ammunition racks and 75mm guns. The first M4A176W tanks finally entered combat on July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, the massive Allied breakout from Normandy. American armor surged through gaps created by the heaviest tactical bombing in military history, with the upgraded Shermans leading the way against German armored reserves already decimated by airstrikes. The impact was immediate. Tank crews reported surviving hits that would have killed them just weeks earlier. Disabled Shermans with penetrated armor, but intact crews. Ammunition racks struck by armor-piercing rounds without catastrophic secondary explosions. The wet stowage system worked exactly as designed, buying precious seconds for crews to escape burning tanks. Word spread quickly through the armored divisions. The new Shermans were survivable. Crews who'd watched friends burn in older models now had a fighting chance. Morale soared, and aggressive tactics became feasible again. Tank commanders took calculated risks they'd never have dared attempt in the fire-prone, older variants. By August 1944, Fisher Body was producing the M4A375W, a new iteration featuring the proven 75mm gun paired with wet stowage, churning out 3,710 units by March 1945. These upgraded tanks flooded the European theater. Every major armored unit received them as older models were rotated back for depot maintenance or written off as combat losses. The Germans took notice. Intelligence reports highlighted unprecedented aggressiveness among American tank crews, Shermans charging into ambushes that should have annihilated them. Disabled tanks with intact crews fighting from defensive positions until recovery vehicles arrived. The psychological advantage of the brew-up kill was vanishing. German tank commanders adapted their tactics. With ammunition detonations no longer reliable, they focused on mobility kills, track shots, engine fires, disabling hits that left Shermans immobile but intact. But even this proved difficult. American combined arms doctrine deployed infantry and tank destroyers alongside the Shermans, providing mutual support that made isolated ambushes nearly impossible. The wet stowage modification didn't make the Sherman invincible. German 88mm guns could still penetrate its armor at combat ranges. Panther tanks with high-velocity 75mm guns could engage Shermans from distances where return fire was ineffective. Tiger tanks were mobile fortresses that required coordinated strikes to destroy. But the Sherman no longer died easily, and in a war of attrition, that changed everything. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski recovered from his injuries and returned to combat in September 1944. This time in an M4A375W. He noticed the differences immediately. The ammunition racks were lower, protected by sealed bins that his loader explained were surrounded by liquid containers. "They call it wet stowage, Sarge," the loader said. "Supposed to keep us from burning if we take a hit." Kowalski ran his hand along the smooth metal bins. "Does it work?" "I don't know, Sarge. Haven't been hit yet." Let's keep it that way. 3 weeks later, near Aachen, Kowalski's Sherman took a direct hit from a Panther tank at 700 meters. The round penetrated the right sponson, exactly where Castellano had died in the old tank, exactly where Kowalski expected to meet the same fate. The impact threw him against the turret wall. Smoke filled the compartment. He heard the loader screaming, but there were no secondary explosions, no chain reaction of detonating ammunition, only smoke and the hiss of liquid escaping from the ruptured bins. Kowalski grabbed the loader and shoved him toward the commander's hatch. The kid scrambled out, coughing but alive. The gunner bailed through his own hatch. The driver and assistant driver escaped through the bow hatches. Kowalski went last, hauling himself out of the smoking turret and rolling off the engine deck. They all made it. 5 men, 0 casualties. Kowalski lay in the grass, watching his tank burn. The ammunition bins remained intact, sealed by the wet stowage system even as the engine fire spread forward. Eventually, the heat would reach the rounds and they'd cook off. But by then, the crew was 200 yards away, safe behind friendly lines. He thought of Castellano, the 19-year-old loader who'd burned to death in 3 seconds when the ammunition detonated. The 11 other crews he'd watched die the same way during the Normandy campaign. The wet stowage system wouldn't bring them back, wouldn't erase the horror of watching friends burn, but it meant the next generation of tank crews had a chance, a real, statistically engineered chance at survival. That was worth the 900 pounds of added weight, worth the logistics headache of shipping liquid-filled containers across the Atlantic, worth every minute of design work and production retooling. Kowalski stood up, dusted himself off, and walked toward the company commander's position to request a replacement tank. Another M4A375W, if possible. He learned the hard way that survival wasn't about invincibility. It was about buying seconds. And in combat, seconds were the difference between coming home and becoming another name on a casualty list. The development of wet stowage traced back to November 1943, when a DuPont chemical engineer attending a tank board meeting proposed a radical idea: surround ammunition with liquid. Early proposals were outlandish. Engineers discussed flooding entire fighting compartments with water, creating submarine-like sealed environments where crews would operate in breathing apparatus. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the concept evolved into something practical. Double-walled ammunition containers with liquid-filled cavities positioned on the hull floor away from likely impact points. The key challenge was finding the right liquid. Pure water worked in testing, but froze in European winters and promoted rust on brass cartridge cases. Adding ethylene glycol prevented freezing but accelerated corrosion and was flammable under certain conditions. The final solution was amidam, a proprietary mixture of ethyl sodium, potassium phosphate, rust inhibitors, and biocides. This fluid remained liquid down to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, prevented corrosion, inhibited bacterial growth, and was more effective at fire suppression than pure water. Each 10-round ammunition rack incorporated 3 sealed chambers of amidam. 75mm variants stored 97 rounds protected by 38 gallons of fluid. 76mm variants held 71 rounds with 36 gallons of protection. Press Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania retooled its assembly lines in December 1943, rolling out the first M4A176W on January 3, 1944. Fisher Body followed with the M4A375W, producing 3,710 units between February 1944 and March 1945. By war's end, virtually every Sherman produced after January 1944 featured wet stowage, over 30,000 tanks with a life-saving modification deployed to Europe and the Pacific. The impact on crew survival was dramatic. Pre-modification, Shermans burned in 60 to 80% of penetrating hits. Wet stowage variants burned in just 10 to 15%, an 85% reduction in ammunition fires. In practical terms, a tank battalion with 50 Shermans suffering 30 penetrating hits would have lost 18 to 24 tanks to fire with dry storage. With wet stowage, only 3 to 5 would burn, leaving 25 to 27 repairable and returnable to combat. The modification didn't just save lives, it maintained American armored strength at levels that accelerated the German defeat. Battalions that would have required complete reorganization after major engagements remained combat effective with minimal casualties. Experienced tank commanders survived to fight again, passing their tactical knowledge to replacements, preserving the institutional memory of armored units. And the Germans never figured it out. Wehrmacht technical intelligence captured hundreds of wet stowage Shermans from Normandy to the Rhine, photographing them, measuring them, test-firing their guns, analyzing their armor. But they never recognized the significance of the liquid-filled ammunition containers. Late 1944 German intelligence reports noted increased Sherman survivability, but attributed it to improved crew training, better combined arms tactics, or enhanced armor quality. Some speculated American crews were bailing out faster, leaving salvageable tanks behind. None identified the real cause. Buried under collapsing logistics and desperate wonder weapon projects, German technical intelligence never looked closely enough. By early 1945, the few remaining specialists focused on jet aircraft and rocket technology, not captured enemy tanks Germany could neither produce nor counter. The information that might have prompted critical tactical changes never reached frontline units. German tank commanders continued relying on ammunition fire tactics against an enemy that no longer fell for them. Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes survived the war. His platoon of M4A 176W Shermans fought from Normandy to the Elbe River, engaging German armor in dozens of actions. They lost 11 tanks to combat damage, 7 repaired and returned to service, 4 written off as total losses from catastrophic crew compartment hits, but none, burned from ammunition detonation. Hayes brought his entire platoon home alive, 20 men who would statistically have died in older model Shermans. In 1947, Hayes attended a veterans reunion. There he met Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski. They'd never served in the same unit, never crossed paths during combat, but they shared a bond stronger than unit affiliation. Both had watched crews burn in dry stowage Shermans. Both had survived hits in wet stowage variants that should have killed them. They stood together, gazing at a restored M4A 375W on display. Its hull cut away to reveal the ammunition storage system, the sealed bins, the fluid containers, the simple engineering solution that had saved thousands of lives. "Did you know what it was when you first saw it?" Hayes asked. Kowalski shook his head. "No idea. The loader told me it was supposed to keep us from burning. I didn't believe him until it actually worked." "How many times did you get hit?" 4 times in wet stowage tanks. Walked away from all of them. Lost 1 tank completely, but the crew got out. The other 2 were repairable." They fell silent for a moment. Then Kowalski said what both were thinking. "I knew a kid named Castellano, 19 years old, loader. Died in the first tank I commanded. Ammunition detonation. Burned to death in about 5 seconds." Hayes nodded. "I lost 11 friends the same way in Normandy, before we got the new tanks. You think about them every day. The wet stowage system didn't bring back the men who died in dry stowage Shermans. It didn't erase the horrors of North Africa, Sicily, or early Normandy, where tank crews burned by the hundreds. But after January 1944, after the modification reached frontline units, the death rate dropped by 85%. Thousands of American, British, Canadian, and Free French tank crews survived hits that would have killed them months earlier. The Sherman's reputation has been debated by historians for decades. Critics highlight its inferior armor and weaponry compared to German heavy tanks. Defenders emphasize its reliability, ease of production, and integration into combined arms tactics. But one fact is undeniable. The wet stowage modification transformed the Sherman from a death trap into a survivable fighting vehicle. It gave crews a fighting chance. And in war, that's all anyone can ask for. If this story moved you, we'd be honored if you'd like this video. It helps us keep sharing these important stories of courage and innovation. Please take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Did you or someone in your family serve during World War II? Maybe you knew a tanker or heard stories about the Sherman from veterans. Share your memories and thoughts below. These personal connections to history matter deeply. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to honor the engineers who designed this life-saving system, the factory workers who built it, and the thousands of tank crews whose lives it saved. These stories must never be forgotten.